All right, so again, I'm Dave Boyer. I'm with Disability Rights Rhode Island. We are a local organization. I think most of you are not from Rhode Island, since it's the smallest state in the world. But our office is in Providence if you're interested. This is not, I'm going to give you the legal mumbo jumbo. This isn't meant to provide any legal advice, and we're not in an attorney-client relationship at this point. Maybe later after we get to know each other, but not at this point. So anyway. Okay, so Disability Rights Rhode Island, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to my organization. I'm the legal director. I've been there for about a month and a half, so I'm new to Rhode Island, so I'm probably newer than some of you in here. But Disability Rights Rhode Island is part of a national network, and you have one of these in your state too. Every state has what is called a protection and advocacy agency. Has anybody ever heard of a protection and advocacy agency? One person? Two. That's about par for the course. So disability rights, the P&A network was developed in the 1970s in reaction to some pretty bad abuse that was happening in a facility in New York. For people with developmental disabilities. There was a lot of press, and a young reporter named Geraldo Rivera broke the story, and Congress got involved and listened to Geraldo and developed this nationwide organization. So there's one in every state. Typically they're disability rights, whatever, but some of them are a little bit different. So I've worked at Disability Rights Florida and now Disability Rights Rhode Island, and I was at the National Disability Rights Network, which is kind of the umbrella organization for the whole network. So what these organizations were intended to do was to advocate and protect the rights of people with developmental disabilities, mostly that were folks that were stuck in facilities and being treated to pretty inhumane conditions. But since then, Congress has expanded that network and expanded our programs. So they added mental illness, they added lots of different programs. Now we have 9 different funding streams, 9 different programs, one of them that would include all people with disabilities. So we've basically extended our reach to from developmental disabilities all the way, now we cover every disability. Those are all state-run, independent organizations. They all provide a variety of legal services that are all free to their consumers, and the federal government gives them a lot of power and a lot of authority. I can go into any facility in Rhode Island right now and take a look around and make sure that no abuse or neglect's occurring. So we have pretty strong powers in that area. We also do a lot of housing rights. We do a lot of education. We do any area that touches on people with disabilities. So that's my plug for our wonderful network. So you have one in your state, and if you Google protection and advocacy in your state, it'll give you your state organization. Again, so what we provide, what all P&As provide, information and referral. So if you call up Disability Rights whatever, and ask them a question and they don't have the resources or they don't have the staff or whatever, they can also provide information and referral to you so that you can find another place that could provide. Because as you work with people with disabilities, you will realize more and more that no one place has all the answers, right? And you have to go from here to here to here to here to all over. So this is just one more step. It might be the step, or it might lead you to another step. It's like a full-time job, isn't it? We also provide advice, self-help materials, and we individually represent, and every P&A individually represents a certain number of clients in smaller actions, so individual actions or just individual advocacy. A lot of times we don't provide, it's not legal help you need, it's more an advocate to go in and negotiate on your behalf. So we do that, we do trainings, and then we go all the way to systemic reform. So I sued the state of Florida like 6 times, for different things on a large scale, looking for, systemic reform. I want changes in this entire program throughout the state. So we do that too. Okay, so this presentation, I'm going to start with kind of an overview of what laws big laws are out there in the federal disability realm. So I'm going to just kind of briefly touch on the big ones that we all know or don't know and need to know. And then I'm going to go into more concrete things that you can do as an advocate for yourself or your child or your family member or whoever. Now this when I describe this process, it may seem a little basic. It seems a little basic to me at times, but it's a process. It's like the fundamentals. It's like a football team doesn't, play the Super Bowl every week. They practice the things. So every time that I advocate, I go back to these principles because you have to go back every time. You never get it down. It's always focusing on these small things to get what you need. Because this advocacy thing is very difficult, as you all know. So anyway, with that said, I'm going to start. So the first big disability, and I'll put air quotes around this, the first law that was passed that affects people with disabilities was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this was in reaction in the 60s. It was Kennedy and Johnson and all those. Their plan to deal with the race relations problem in the United States in the 60s. So this outlawed discrimination based on a lot of things: color, religion, sex, national origin. You don't see disability here, so we're not covered by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You don't see gender. It's race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. But it was one of the most significant legislative acts in the United States history, according to the experts. It was a very wide-ranging, if you were around in the 60s, school desegregation, everything, all those big programs. The aim of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was to obtain integration of all of these people into society. So instead of being isolated in their little communities or their little ghettos or what have you, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was supposed to end discrimination and move people into the larger community so that everybody could live happily ever after. Of course, no act does that, but again, people with disabilities were excluded from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. However, we started adding programs based on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The first big one was the Rehabilitation, I was going to say rehab, and then I continued. Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So this is the Rehab Act. This is Section 504. This is the big one that you can use when you feel like you're being discriminated as a person with a disability. Anytime that you need a reasonable accommodation, and by reasonable accommodation I mean, so a program is denying you service because of your disability, you can request a reasonable accommodation to their rules. So they don't allow service animals into this program. You can request a reasonable accommodation that allows your service animal. They don't allow this. You can request a reasonable accommodation. Effective communication is another big one. Physical accessibility, making sure that people with disabilities are able to enter public accommodations just like everybody else. Again, with the aim of increasing the ability of people with disabilities to enter the community and live like everybody else. Problem with this one, it only includes programs that are funded by the federal government. So anything like that's funded by Medicaid or Medicare, or if they get a federal grant, or if they're a school and they get federal funding for education, they're all covered by Section 504. And Section 504 includes all these protections. The problem with Section 504, it was passed, and then all of the little regulations that came with it that actually told you what this big law means, they didn't get implemented when the law was passed. And it took years. It took from 73 to 1977, so I don't know how many years that is. That's 4. See that? Right on the fly. 4 years to implement those. So this kind of tells you the struggle that we face in the disability rights realm. We get this great statute, this Rehab Act of 1973, but nobody can use it. They can't apply it because they don't have all the rules to implement it. So If you watch the movie Crip Camp, and I recommend you do, it tells the whole story about this implement. It sounds boring, but it's really not. It's a whole story. Crip Camp was a camp in the, I think, 60s or 70s where all these people with disabilities would go and hang out every summer. Well, all of those folks, after the Rehab Act was passed, got really mad about the fact that there were no regulations, so they camped out in these regulators' offices for weeks at a time until they finally made the regulations. So it's a big success story. It's a good way of, it's a really genius way of how people with disabilities advocated for themselves to make things happen. Okay. Then we get the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is the biggie. This is the mama jama of them all, right? This is based directly from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this, essentially, the Americans with Disabilities Act, with some differences, but essentially what the Americans with Disabilities Act did was it extended the protections of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to people with disabilities. So now you have all the rights that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 provided, plus a few other things. It also was an extension of the Rehab. The Rehab Act, or Section 504, covered only those places that receive federal funding. Americans with Disabilities Act expanded that to everybody. So it was a huge expansion, passed under the Bush administration, and it has 5 titles. Most of them we don't care about, but number 1 is employment. So if you're discriminated based on your disability in an employment setting, you would sue under Title I. Title II covers public places. So if you're in a restaurant and you're being discriminated, or a doctor's office, that's Title II. I'm sorry, that's wrong. Who lets me talk at these things? Title II is governmental. So if a governmental entity is discriminating against you, if you go to, say, the VA, or you go to a federal hospital, you know, one of those things, then you're covered. Or if a federal agency is discriminating on you based on your disability, then Title II would cover you. Title III is restaurants, doctor's offices, public accommodations. Title IV is telecommunications. It's very specific about websites and all of that. And then miscellaneous, which is my favorite because it includes a retaliation. So if you file an Americans with Disabilities Act against a restaurant, say, and then they retaliate against you, you can sue them again for retaliation and get more money. So it's all about the money. Anyway, so that's the Americans with Disabilities Act. That extended protections. I'm sure you've all heard of the ADA. If you haven't, Google it. It's awesome. Okay, next. The Fair Housing Act. Okay, so the Fair Housing Act, originally 68. Again, not for people with disabilities. They got added in 88. And this just extends protections in the home. So the Fair Housing Act requires that your housing provider, your landlord, your condo association, they provide reasonable accommodations or modifications so that you can live and enjoy your dwelling. That's the language, interfering with the enjoyment of dwelling. So you have to be able to enjoy your dwelling place. If you're not, based on their actions, discriminating against you as a person with a disability, then you can sue under the Fair Housing Act. 2 things for the Fair Housing Act. You can request a reasonable accommodation. It makes me cry too. You can request a reasonable accommodation, which means that I am requesting a change to your rules. So, maybe you need maybe in your condo association, they don't allow outside people to come in and help with people with disabilities, and a personal aide or a personal assistant. You can request a reasonable accommodation to their rules to allow that person in. Or if you have a, emotional support animal, any change to their rules, and if you're from Florida and you're in a condo association or homeowners, you know what rules are. Those rules can all be, you can request a modification or accommodation to their rules that allows you to enjoy your dwelling because of your disability. Something about that rule that prevents that. The other thing is modification. Modifications are changes to your house or your apartment or your condo that because of your disability prevent you from enjoying your dwelling. So ramps and towel, the towel holders and all that stuff, that's all a modification. Big difference between accommodations and modifications are that accommodations, you can't be charged for these, whereas modifications, you have to pay for the modification to your apartment. So that's the big difference there. Okay. And then the big one under education, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. So this is 1990 as well, and this provides all of those, all the rules for how schools are required to accommodate people with disabilities in their schools. So everyone, the basis for IDEA is that everyone is entitled to a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE. Everybody likes to say FAPE. So every kid in a school district is entitled to a free and appropriate public education. The IDEA has those rules that make it such that people with disabilities get that free and appropriate public education. And it all starts with the IEP, the bane of everybody's existence. But this is that agreement that you enter in. So you have an IEP meeting, you go into the school, you meet with the teachers, the principal, the whatever, all the care people, and everybody hammers out this individual education plan that tells what's the school going to do to accommodate your student in their program. And then they're supposed to implement that IEP and yada, yada, yada. Education has to be provided in the least restrictive environment, so they have to provide school. You can't just segregate all the kids in one classroom unless there's a really good reason for that. They have to have an appropriate evaluation, so if there's a kid with a disability, they're entitled to an appropriate evaluation. Parents, teachers, all have to be involved, and there are procedural safeguards in place. So essentially what happens is your kid is identified as a kid with disabilities, and they're required to kind of find all of these kids with disabilities, identify them, and then offer an individual education plan. You go through that process, they are allowed to implement it, and then if they don't do a good job, then there are protections in place. You go to what's called a due process. That's all real boring stuff, but know that the IDEA protects the rights of each kid to have that free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So you're entitled in an IEP process to request whatever services and supports that you need to make sure that your kid is set up for success. Okay? And the overall goal is community integration. Again, I said this over and over again. I put this in red even because it was important. Everyone with a disability should be able to live in the community and fully participate in the community to the best of their ability. So all of these laws, the big intent of these laws is to make sure that we provide those supports, those services, those accommodations, those modifications, all of it intended so that we don't have, areas where it's just people with disabilities stuck in this area, not allowed to get out in the community. Everybody with a disability should be able to live in wherever they want to live. They should be able to work wherever they want to live. They should go to school. They should go to church, everything in the most integrated way possible. So that's the goal of all of these. I sound like I'm a salesman for this thing. Any questions? I guess I can, I'm going to, before I go into the actual, no. I hope I haven't lost anybody with those legal mumbo jumbo. Yes, I'll go. Absolutely, yeah. The question is, an IEP is not just for physical disabilities. It's any disability. Yeah, it could be anything. I mean, it could be, it could be a disability involving skin, for instance, may be relevant to this population, right? Yeah, it could be any disability. If your kid needs special skincare, special, timeouts, cooling, whatever, those can all be requested or, demanded, quite frankly, in an IEP to make sure that that kid's successful. I saw another one. Any other? Yep, right there. Do you work for a facility? The question is, we're jumping back to my access to any facility to do an inspection. There's a lot of laws about that. I have actually I gave a 2-day seminar in DC, I wish you were there, but last month on our access authority. But essentially no, especially if we have a report or we believe strongly that abuse or neglect's occurring, we can go in at any time instantaneously. Now, we also do what's called a monitoring, where we don't have a report. We don't suspect there's abuse or neglect occurring here, but we'd really like to know just kind of how it's going in this facility. That's called monitoring, and we're a little less. We typically do give notice in those cases just because it makes it easier and there's no reason not to. But there's some question about whether we do need to give notice. We typically do. But by and large, we can pretty much go anywhere we want. Yeah. And that's any place. It's not just facilities. It's also clinics. It's anywhere. So anywhere where a person with a disability is receiving services or supports. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, for sure. The question is, her husband is a disabled vet, and she is the caregiver. How do these laws apply to you? Most of these laws apply also to the caregiver. So in legal mumbo jumbo, you have a cause of action as another party involved. So essentially, if you're affected by, if somebody is doing something in this location because of his disability and it affects you, you also can bring an action. If that makes sense. Is that what you're asking? Also, most of these, like IDEA, which wouldn't apply for your husband, parents and guardians are involved. Anytime there's a guardianship, that person has certain rights under these laws too. So the aim is to include the family, but that's not always, there. Yes. It's a good question. She's asking the difference between an individual education plan under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, versus a 504 plan under the Rehab Act. It's a good question. I'm not exactly an education attorney, but I'll give you my take on it. I supervise some education attorneys. So essentially, IDEA tends to be, I guess, more regimented. It's more like you have to prove that this person has all of the elements of a disability. You have to do all this stuff to document all this stuff for an IEP and then go through all that due process stuff. Whereas a 504, anytime the school receives funding, they have to provide reasonable accommodations. So it's a lot easier to get a 504 plan. It just doesn't have all the protections. So which is better? I don't know. It's easier to get this, but you're not as protected. It's easier to get a 504 plan, but you don't have all the protections of IDEA. So, it's kind of, if you believe that the school's really going to do all this stuff, then I would go with the 504. But if you're suspicious, like me, then I would go IDEA. I guess that's a simple way. Again, not being an education attorney, but yes. Oh, that's right. Yes. And if they say something different than what I said, you misunderstood me.
A lot of job applications now have a voluntary disclosure of disability, and it says that it doesn't affect your whether you'll be hired or not. But what is it good to let them know about the disability beforehand on the application, or should you?
I'm having a hard time hearing. Sorry, can you start? I'm sorry. Can you
Sure.
start over?
Can I just talk like this?
Yes. That's a mom.
A lot of job applications recently have had the question voluntary disclosure of the fact that you have a disability.
Mm-hmm.
And you can choose, yes, I have a disability, no, I do not, or I choose not to disclose. How does that, they say it doesn't affect hiring, but does it?
Why would it be on there? You know, I mean, I'm pretty suspicious about a question like that. The laws protect you from having to do so. So, you know, as an attorney, I would say don't tell them that. It's none of their business.
Because if you choose no, but you have a disability.
Mm-hmm. That's a problem. I wouldn't say no. I would just choose not to disclose.
Thank you.
That's what I would do. Okay. Anything else? Yes. Over here. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So the question is, so the IDA covers you through school, then you get out and get a job. What are the contours, I guess, of that, and how do you advocate for yourself? There's a couple things. I mean, the ADA covers employment under Title I. So any of their crap where they're being kind to you, I mean, they're required to be kind to you, especially if they know you have a disability. You don't have to request an accommodation or a modification or anything like that if they know you have a disability, if it's obvious to them. If you're in a wheelchair and they don't provide a way into their building, then they're in trouble. You don't have to request, you don't have to say, well, I have a wheelchair, can I please have a door? You don't have to do that if it's obvious on its face. So that would be my first thing. There's also, you know, the the Assisted Technology Program, and what am I talking? The people that help you with employment, and I'm blanking on the name of them. Yeah, VR. Thank you. Jeez, you'd think I wasn't in this field, wouldn't you? So the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation in your state also could provide some things like that. But I would say if you're getting messed with for your disability in an employment setting, I would either go to VR, I would go to the Protection Advocacy for help. Okay. All right. Anything else? Okay, cool. All right, so let's get into then. Okay, so the 10 steps to effective self-advocacy. And again, this is very basic, but it provides kind of a structure that I use to explain how to advocate, you know, self-advocate, advocate on your own behalf with organizations. And I go back to this all the time because I have to self-advocate because I am in the VA system. And the VA system, and you know, it's not, it's sometimes not the most user-friendly organization. Wonderful when they do a good job, but sometimes they don't, and I have to advocate for myself. And instead of sitting in an office and just yelling at somebody, I have to go back and think of these steps on how to self-advocate. It's basically, a lot of this comes down to documenting, making sure that you're communicating effectively, and just being kind and all that, just being that. So as we go through these. So first is believe in yourself and prioritize your needs. So, you know, everyone with a disability has a different scope of needs. You know, every blind person doesn't have the same needs or required accommodations as every other blind person. Everybody with a skin condition doesn't have the same needs as everybody else. So you know what you need, what's going to make it so that you can be effective. You need to communicate that. Also know that you are important, and you are part of a community. You contribute to that community. You are important. Don't let people walk over you. I guess you can make decisions. You can have a good life, but you have to plan it. And people with disabilities face a struggle all the time in getting what they need to be successful in school, in work, in everywhere. So the first step is essentially to bolster yourself, realize that you are important, you are an individual, figure out what you need, and then plan for how to get that. Know your rights. Know all of the laws pertaining to your disability. And know all the rules. Because remember, laws like the ADA are these giant things that Congress spends all this time making. They don't really mean much until there's regulations. So know those regulations. And then those don't mean anything until they get down to policies and procedures for an agency. Know all of those. So it's a ton of education that you have to do to know the big laws, the regulations, the small policies and procedures, all of this in any area. You have to become an expert because they're going to use the rules against you. So you should probably know the rules so that you can come back. So many times I get people with disabilities in my office, and they're in a situation that's covered by a regulation specifically, and it's not being honored. And once you communicate to the caregiver or the facility or whoever, they change their policies because they just didn't maybe realize that was the rule. Believe it or not, there's a lot of rules out there. So as much as you can become an expert on your condition, your situation, your needs, you should also become an expert on, as much as you can, the rules, the laws, the policies and procedures, all of that stuff that regulates how that care is delivered. Keep records. So make sure you write this down. Make sure if they say something, get it in writing. Get your records. You're entitled to get, most states, you're entitled to a copy of your records. You're entitled to have them write this down. If they don't, email them and see, I want to memorialize our conversation on this date. Please confirm this is what we spoke about and this is what we spoke about. Things of that nature. As much as you can get it in writing, the better, because later on, that will be effective. Hopefully you'll never need it. Hopefully you won't have to prove that, Jane Doe told you this on this date. Hopefully they just will say, yeah, I said that. But sometimes they don't, so it's nice to have it in writing. Sometimes you have to show a history of your efforts. So when I get people in my office who have a legal case or an advocacy case, I really want to know the timeline of what went on. So it's really nice to see that all in writing. Well, I wanted this, so on September 3rd, I asked this person for this, and they said no. And on October this, they asked, and they said no. All the different people that were involved, what they do, and what they said, all is very beneficial. Just keeping a record of what happened so that I can, as your attorney or your advocate, I can look back, or the facility or the organization, they can look back and see, well, gosh, they tried everything. I don't know. So, or maybe they missed something along the way. Maybe they didn't. Maybe you should try this, and you try that. So all of that, getting a timeline, substantiating your story, making sure that you have kind of that proof down the line and that record of what you've done. Prepare and plan. So when you go into one of these meetings, write down all your questions and things. I go to the doctor and I don't even know what he said at the end of my appointment half the time. My wife says, "What did he say?" I don't know what he said. He gave me some medication. So make sure beforehand, and you only get a certain amount of time with these doctors, with these other, administrators, make sure that you know what you're going to ask. Every time I go into a meeting, I've got a list of questions that I want to ask. They may not be word for word, but I've got at least an outline of the information that I want. Because you get in here and you get sidetracked and you get off topic. Having a list or an outline helps you to keep focused and get the information that you need. Be creative and assertive. Every parent in here is shaking their head now, or should be, or nodding their head, whatever that is. You got to be creative, right? You have to be able to, you have to decide what is going to be a reasonable condition for your child or yourself. You know, it may not be the perfect solution for your situation. You may have to carve out different things just to make it work. You may have to be creative to make that happen. You may have to be able to communicate that and what you really need, and here's some things that we can make that happen in a different way. And number 3 down here, conflict is inevitable. It's always there, right? Conflict is, whenever you're asserting your rights, there's going to be conflict. Almost always. Typically always. People get their feelings hurt, or they think you're demanding too much, or whatever. They're going to get mad. You're going to be a little upset at times when you're advocating for yourself or someone else. So just make sure that you realize that ahead of time and just try to be assertive and not aggressive. Don't get no fist fights. Unless you're with the VA, you can punch them. I don't care. But be assertive, so get your point across. You've got an outline. You know what you want to say. You know what you want. You can communicate that in a professional way, and this is what I want. These are my rights. This is what you have to give me, not, get in a giant blow-up argument. That might happen, but hopefully not. And then my favorite, get everything in writing. Again, the meetings are going to be stressful, especially IEP meetings and stuff like that. Hopefully that'll all be in writing. You get an IEP plan at the end. But, other meetings, there's going to be a lot of jargon. There's going to be a lot of communication. Get written notes. Get everything. Get decisions in writing as much as possible so you all have that. I see a question in the back.
With ichthyosis, and I got to tell you, I've been afraid to ask for accommodations. I've been afraid at work when I started in the job saying, I need an accommodation. And I'm telling y'all, don't be afraid. We're taught throughout our lives, I think, I was taught throughout our lives to hide, to say, I'm confident I can do the job. I didn't want to talk about my skin. I didn't want to talk about my ichthyosis because I was afraid. I was afraid that people would think I couldn't do the job, that people would think that I couldn't do what was being asked of me. And so convincing myself that it was okay to talk about what I need to succeed was a really difficult thing for me. So when I entered the workplace, I hid my disability. I closed my door to do skincare. I didn't talk about the things I needed to do to succeed as a lawyer. When I was out with clients, I hid that I had mobility issues. I didn't like talking to my coworkers, to my partners, to my clients that, hey, this is really hard for me. It's hard for me to be walking out, doing all of this walking. I need more time. And that's a hard conversation for people to have because we want to prove to everyone, or at least I wanted to prove to everyone that I could do it, that I was good enough. And convincing myself, that was really tough. And so I'm telling you here, you are entitled under the law. The law says you are entitled to reasonable accommodations. Do not second guess yourself. Go into that conversation with HR, with your supervisor, saying, I can do the job, and here's the accommodation that I need to do my job. And I gotta tell you, I work at the EEOC, and it was tough when I had that conversation for the first time. We're like in the world of Zoom now, right? And I was in charge of like buying AV equipment and buying tripods. And you know what? The tripod that they handed me for like setting up the AV equipment, I couldn't set it up. I didn't have the grip to set it up. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what am I gonna do? Do I need to call someone? There's no one else in the building. What do I do? And the answer is, I am entitled to an accommodation under the law. They had to buy me equipment that I could set up myself. And it took me, a lawyer, a disability rights lawyer, it took me time to get over my fear of having that conversation. So yes, absolutely, document everything, but be aggressive, be assertive, and don't be afraid.
Nice. That was totally not a plant, by the way. But thank you, Rachel. That was great. Yeah, firsthand. Okay, so right to appeal. Every decision has a higher authority, right? So you don't have to stop at the first no. They say no, you keep going, keep going. I want to talk to your supervisor, or there's either an informal supervisor that you can talk to, but most likely under these federal laws, there is also protections that give you due process rights. So you can formally appeal these things, and if you need to do that, a lot of times it's helpful to get an advocate like myself, one of these disability rights organizations, or sometimes legal aid, one of these organizations to help you, because these processes are very specific and almost judicial, oftentimes judicial in nature. So make sure as you go along that you're getting really good advice and support and advocacy as you go along. But don't take that first no as the answer. Make sure you keep going up the chain of command until you get to what you need. Again, make sure these appeals often have strict procedures and timelines. So you get that no. If you're like me, then I just want to say, well, screw it for a while, and I don't even want to deal with it. Well, you can't do that because you might have 30 days to appeal that. So make sure that you continue to be tenacious and push for those things. So make sure that you don't miss a timeline or a deadline. Interim solutions. So while you're waiting on this process, is there anything this agency or this person or this organization can do for you in the meantime? It might not be your ultimate goal that you're appealing for, but a lot of times there are things that they can do temporarily. They can temporarily provide these things. So inquire about that, while you're waiting. And then confirm everything again. Writing. Make sure you read everything. If it's this big, long document, you're going to want to, it's not going to be like that website that has that whole thing and you have to agree and then before you get on the website. Make sure that you read everything. Make sure that it really says what you agreed to. Make sure that what you're supposed to do, what they're supposed to do, all this stuff, and talk to other people. You don't have to sign this right then and there. It's not like a timeshare. You have some time to think about it, show it to your friends, show it to your family, show it to your advocates, show it to an attorney before you sign it, because there's going to be very important rights that are memorialized in that document. And if you sign it and it's not right, then you've made an agreement already. So don't sign it. And then follow up and thank. So make sure that all these deadlines that are in this document, make sure that they're being kept. Just because they say they're going to do something doesn't mean that then they do it. So keep on them. Make sure that you are persistent. Make sure that they're doing all the things in the right times, all the deadlines. Keep your address up to date. This is from the guy that moves like every couple years. Make sure that your address and your email and your phone number and all that are up to date. And thank people along the way. If they did you a favor, or not a favor, but if they did a good job, sometimes it's unusual in these organizations for someone to go above and beyond the call of duty. So, thank them. That goes a long way. I probably should say also, the people that, this isn't on here, but those people that don't do a good job, make sure you follow up on that too. Let their people know that this, Sally Johnson really screwed me along the way on this process. Make sure that as you're thanking the people that are doing a good job, you're also making sure that these people are also acknowledged for doing a bad job and standing in the way of the process. So, okay, and that is, we've got a few minutes. This is my contact information. Again, you can reach out to me anytime. And I think I guess you can reach out to me. I have some cards too I can give out afterwards. But anytime you need something, I can direct you at least to your state, to the organization that serves your state as the Protection Advocacy. I might have some ideas. Who knows? I might just be another person along the way that gets you to where you need to be. So never hesitate to reach out to me if you have questions. Okay, and you have a question? No. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the question is there a distinction under the law for rare diseases opposed to other no. Mm-mm. You have a disability, or your husband has a disability. That person has a disability. It's defined in law. It doesn't say this is, it has to be a common, it doesn't have to be. No, each law, and I probably wasn't as specific as I should have been, but each one of these laws, when they provide that you get accommodations or they provide something to help you succeed based on your disabilities, it has to be individually tailored. So they can't just say, okay, this person's deaf, so here's what they get as an accommodation. They can't do that. They have to look at your individual situation, and they have to carve out individualized things to accommodate that disability. So, no, I don't think it makes sense. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. She's saying that there are specific statutes for rare diseases at the federal level. Some states have not implemented. That's where advocacy comes in. I mean, that's where it is. I mean, I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but that's where, that's how Section 504 regulations got implemented. It was from people advocating for that. So, as a person with a rare disease, you're not going to have that huge network of people as others might. So you're going to have to be that smaller and tenacious and all that. So, got somebody in the back?
So I'm aware that pursuing your legal rights can be incredibly burdensome, and you're not going to be seeking these rights unless you already have a full plate. So what are the resources available initially when people realize, I think I'm entitled legally to some help, but how do I set up a filing system? How do I make sure I have the right software on my computer to access the websites that tell me how to do this? Who can help me understand this totally other legal bureaucratic language? What if I don't speak English? Those essential nuts and bolts pieces I worry about. It's just a huge task to do all the things you outlined as the critical steps, but actually doing that, who are the helpers that can get you through this maze?
That's a great question. So the question is, these giant laws are great, but it's difficult to bring these actions. They can be expensive. You need a lot of resources. What are some things that you can do at a low. I always advocate for doing what you can at the least level, right? You should try to negotiate as much as possible. And who can help you, that's a little more difficult. You know, that's where you develop your network. That's why you come here. So you reach out to people with the same, maybe the same disability, maybe similar disabilities. But there's also organizations like the EEOC or the state version of that, or your state Department of Education. You know, state agencies can provide sometimes some information on how to proceed, hit or miss. Again, and when I said at the beginning, this is a full-time job sometimes. It's to locate those. And you might find this person that leads you to this person that leads you to this, and sometimes it's not a very clear path to how you do that. I would suggest the Protection and Advocacy Network, because that's what they do. They work with people with disabilities. And if that's I think that's a first stop, because they may not have the answers, they may not have the resources, but they may be able to direct you to the next step. Because a lot of what they do is information and referral. So, you know, finding any of these legal aids, sometimes local legal aids, it all depends. It's these nonprofits oftentimes are very limited in their resources, so they're limited in what they might be able to do, but they probably know somebody else that they can talk to. So it's really kind of you have to find it, and it's not easy sometimes. So that's a very unsatisfying answer. Any other questions? Okay, well, I think we're just about done then. All right, well, thanks, everybody. I'll be around. I have some cards. Thank you. Enjoy your conference. Oh, also, very important, I forgot to mention, I know there's an outing tonight at Pepe's Pizza, which I highly recommend, but at the local park, there's a food truck Fridays, and I'm only in Providence for about a month and a half so far. I've been to this. That's the one thing I can recommend. Roger Williams Park, food truck Fridays. You can get crab, what are they called? Not crab cakes. What are they? Crab fritter. There's fritters. They are fritters, but they don't call them that. They call them clam cakes. Clam cakes. They're like a big hush puppy with clam in them. They're great. He doesn't like them, but they're great. Anyway, thanks, everybody. Enjoy your time.
Thanks, Dave. We really appreciate you coming out and helping us out with all that really, really valuable information. So what we're doing next is lunch. I'm going to ask you that if you have stuff with you, you take everything with you. We're going to do an activity during lunch, and when you come back in, you're not going to be sitting in the same place you are now. We're going to try and mix you up a little bit so you're sitting and eating with people you don't know. If you don't know anybody, then you're all set. But we don't want people who know each other sitting with each other, and we're going to have an activity during that lunch. Enjoy yourself.